My name is Richard Wexlar. I'm Executive Director of the National Coalition for Child Protection Reform. I'm going to look now at the time because I did promise I would put some limits on myself. I am honored to be invited to speak at Issaroon's International Women's Day for Women of African Descent Conference, and I am honored to be included among the outstanding Minnesota leaders who will speak next. I have known Khalees Houston and her outstanding work for a few years now. Thanks to a Google search, I know a little bit about the great work of Judge Lang and Ms. Iman. It is a privilege to be in their company. I want to begin by telling you about the unusual route that led me here. For most of my professional life, I was either a journalist or a professor of journalism. I covered my first child welfare story when I was a journalism student in 1976. I interviewed a woman who was at the time 21. By the time she was 9 years old, she had been in 9 different foster homes. She told me she survived by keeping the rage inside, as she put it, unlike my 5 brothers who've been in every jail in New York State. This is some of what she said. When you spend your life going from place to place and knowing you're not going to be in any place for very long, you learn not to reach out, not to care, not to feel. My bitterness is not that I went through what I did. My bitterness is that I don't think it should have had to happen. There was no reason my family's life should have been destroyed. After speaking to this woman for about 2.5 hours, I came out with a couple of conclusions. First, I was really glad I had chosen journalism as a career. And second, I knew I would keep coming back to the story. As I did keep coming back to the story, I kept finding that the facts on the ground weren't matching what the most widely quoted so-called experts kept saying. When the dichotomy became too much to bear, I wrote a book on the topic, and ultimately that led me into advocacy. I remain in advocacy because now, more than 40 years later, thousands of children continue to suffer as that former foster child did. Here are a few examples. In Orange County, California, an impoverished single mother can't find someone to watch her children while she works at night tending a ride in a theme park. So she leaves her 8, 6, and 4-year-old children alone in the motel room that is the only housing they can afford. Someone calls Child Protective Services. Instead of helping to provide child care, they immediately take away the children. Minnesota takes away children at 4 times the rate of Orange County, California. In New York City, at the end of a long day, an exhausted African-American single mother puts her 5-year-old daughter to bed and takes a bath with her headphones on. The child gets out of bed and, when she can't find her mother, does exactly as she is supposed to do, heads for her grandmother's house across the street. As one lawyer told the New York Times, in another community, your kid's found outside looking for you because you're in the bathtub. It's, oh my God, a story to tell later. In a poor community, it's called endangering the welfare of your child. So the child was placed in foster care. Minnesota takes away children at nearly 5 times the rate of New York City. And in Morrison County, Minnesota, authorities apparently didn't like the fact that Amanda Weber didn't say how high when various doctors said jump. After a nurse provided what a judge would later term disinformation to authorities, Amanda's 10-month-old son was torn from her. He would spend the next 4 months, nearly 1/4 of his life, in foster care. Amanda explained what that did to the little boy. Just like he screamed when he was taken from me, he screams like that now when I even leave the room. Now, a lot of us heard those kinds of screams when the news site ProPublica obtained audio from one of the places where the Trump administration held the children it tore from their parents at the Mexican border. Unlike those behind the Trump policy, the people who work for Child Protective Services agencies, even those who are most prone to needlessly remove children, almost always mean well. And there are some great people on the front lines in these agencies fighting against wrongful removal and for families from within. I think you're going to hear from one of them soon. But I find no comfort to be taken from the fact that workers who take children needlessly almost always mean well, because the children still shed the same sorts of tears for the same sorts of reasons. What so many cases have in common are the two biggest failings of the system: the confusion of poverty with neglect and the racial bias that permeates the system. That confusion of poverty with neglect is far more common than the horror stories that make headlines. 3 separate studies have found that 30% of America's foster children could be home right now if their parents just had adequate housing. A 4th study found that, quote, in terms of reunification, even substance abuse is not as important a factor as income or housing in determining whether children will remain with their families. Why is poverty so easily confused with neglect? In part, it's because the poor are defined into our neglect laws. What is neglect? In Ohio, it's when a child's, quote, condition or environment is such as to warrant the state in the interests of the child in assuming his guardianship. In Mississippi, it's when a child is without proper care, custody, supervision, or support. And in Minnesota, it's pretty much anything and everything. I'm going to shorten this presentation simply by not trying to read even excerpts from the Minnesota neglect law, but no matter what, it's all in there. Despite this breathtakingly broad language, the people who run CPS agencies always say, foster care is the last resort. We only take away children when absolutely necessary. But if these claims were true, then similar places would have similar rates of removal. They don't. NCCPR has created a rate of removal index in which we compare the number of children removed from their homes over the course of a year, both to the total child population, but more importantly, to the number of poor children in each state. It turns out that Minnesota takes away children at a rate more than double the national average, and roughly triple the rate of states that have been national leaders in using safe, proven programs to keep families together. Only 7 states take away proportionately more children than Minnesota. So either Minnesota is a cesspool of depravity with vastly more child abuse than most of America, or Minnesota is taking away far too many children. Now, I'd like you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine you went to a doctor and he told you the following: 80% of my patients don't get any better. A lot of the time, they get worse. 1/3 of the time, I commit malpractice. But, the doctor continues, if you'll just pay me even more money and build me a fancy new hospital, I'm sure I can reduce my failure rate to only about 60%. Have we got a deal? Yeah. So now, consider a study of foster care alumni conducted by Casey Family Programs and Harvard Medical School. The foster children had double the rate of post-traumatic stress disorder of Gulf War veterans. Only 20% of the alumni could be said to be doing well as young adults. And nearly 1/3 of the alumni reported they had been abused by a foster parent or another adult in a foster home. Now, the authors of the study went on to design a complex mathematical formula to attempt to figure out how much they could improve these outcomes if every single problem besetting the foster care system were magically fixed. Their answer? 22.2%. In other words, if tomorrow foster care were magically made perfect, it would churn out walking wounded only 3 times out of 5 instead of 4 times out of 5. Now, foster care apologists have a ready-made excuse for these dismal outcomes. Oh, it must have been because of what happened to the children before they were placed. But other studies refute that. 2 massive studies involving more than 15,000 typical cases found that on average, children left in their own homes in such cases fared significantly better in later life even than comparably maltreated children placed in foster care. A University of Minnesota study using different methodology came up with strikingly similar results. But foster care apologists will say, what about cases where, for example, the parent has a substance abuse problem? And that is, of course, the standard excuse for Minnesota's high rate of child removal. Now, there are 2 problems with this. First, Minnesota has been an extreme outlier for as long as anyone's been collecting data. Now, that slide goes back only about 10 years, but the earliest state-by-state survey I know of Goes back to 1985. Minnesota was an extreme outlier then, too. But secondly, to the extent that drugs are a factor in high rates of child removal, it's due less to substance use than to child welfare's failed knee-jerk take the child and run response to substance use. That's because child welfare learned nothing from a previous worst drug plague ever, crack cocaine. Researchers studied two groups of children born with cocaine in their systems. One group placed in foster care, the other group left with birth mothers able to care for them. At 6 months of age, the children were tested using the normal measures of infant development, sitting up, reaching out, rolling over. Consistently, the children left in their own homes did better. For the foster children, the removal from their mothers was more toxic than the cocaine. It is extremely difficult to take a swing at so-called bad mothers without the blow landing on their children. Now, that doesn't mean we can simply leave children with hopelessly addicted parents. But not every parent with a substance use problem is automatically always guilty of child neglect, even though, by the way, Minnesota law says they are. When you hear scare numbers like, when Minnesota children are taken away, 44% of the time it's because of, quote, substance abuse, unquote, yes, that covers the mother who gave birth in the family's home meth lab in the basement. It also covers the mother who drank marijuana tea to ease the pain of labor or smoked a joint to be able to keep food down during her pregnancy. And that 44% figure, by the way, is simply based on caseworkers checking a box on a form indicating they suspect substance use. Sometimes that suspicion is based on strong evidence, but it also may be just a guess, and either way, it's a great way to get a judge to approve removal. Now, of course, not every pot-smoking mom is at risk of losing her child. Affluent pot-smoking moms can actually brag about it in Facebook groups. It's only the children of poor mothers, especially poor mothers of color, who are really at risk of enduring foster care if mom smokes a joint. Now, where drug abuse really does endanger children, those infants in that Florida study are trying to tell us something. In most cases, drug treatment for the mother is a better option than foster care for the child. And when inpatient treatment is necessary, then it should be in places where parents and their children can live together. Better yet, bring the treatment into the home. That's what they're doing in Connecticut, a state hard hit by opioids, but which takes away children at a rate less than half the rate of Minnesota. Oh, and one last point about that 44% figure. What about the other 56%? Minnesota's obscene rate of removal suggests a lot of them don't need to be in foster care either. None of this means that no child ever should be taken from her or his parents. But foster care is an extremely toxic intervention that should be used sparingly and in very small doses. Everybody pays lip service to that, of course. But for more than 160 years, America has prescribed megadoses of foster care, and Minnesota has been among the worst overprescribers. In fact, Minnesota seems to be addicted to the misuse and overuse of foster care. But while I don't have evidence to support all that needless removal of children, the foster care industrial complex has some great applause lines. We're child-focused, they say. We're standing up for children's rights, they say. And over they tell us we have to err on the side of the child. I doubt there is another phrase in the entire child welfare lexicon that has done more harm to children than err on the side of the child. When children are screaming in a detention center on the border or a foster home in Minnesota because they never needed to be taken away, don't know where their parents are, and don't know if they'll ever see them again, how is that erring on the side of the child? That harm occurs even when the foster home is a good one. The majority are. But there is far more abuse in foster care than in the general population, and far more than generally realized. The official figures on this are garbage. That's because the official figures that agencies put out involve agencies investigating themselves. Over and over again, independent studies find vastly higher rates of abuse in foster care than those official figures. And as bad as those outcomes are for family foster homes, the record of group homes and institutions is even worse. If a child is taken from a safe home only to be beaten, raped, or killed in foster care, how is that erring on the side of the child? But even that isn't the worst of it. While workers are interrogating families over poverty, something else isn't getting done. A visit by a caseworker isn't getting made, or it doesn't happen. And the extra phone call isn't made. A child in foster care is not seen. So a child in real danger is missed. The take the child and run approach makes all children less safe. The only way to really err on the side of the child is to err on the side of the family. All of these problems are compounded by racial bias. Believing that there is no racial bias in child welfare requires believing that the bias that permeates every other aspect of American life magically evaporates at the child welfare agency door. Yet an alarming number of child welfare professionals really do believe that. Now, at a minimum, you'd think they'd share with us the magic formula. Tell us the secret sauce, so that policing, hiring, housing, and everything else you can think of could become as pure and bias-free as child welfare. In fact, racial bias was the very reason America first created a child welfare system anything like the form we know today. It was largely the creation of that man, Charles Loring Brace, a Protestant minister in New York City. He hated and feared New York's immigrants, most of them Catholics. He called them the scum and refuse of ill-formed civilizations. He deemed the parents genetically inferior, but nevertheless felt the children could be saved if only they could be taken from those parents and shipped off to farms in the South and Midwest. So that's what happened to more than 100,000 children, taken away on so-called orphan trains. Some were orphans, many were not. Some were well treated in this first version of foster care, many were not. It's not all that hard to find similar sentiments today in comments offered by public officials and child welfare leaders, usually in unguarded moments. Consider the comments of one Michael Petit, the former executive director of a group calling itself Every Child Matters. He was a leading member of the so-called Commission to Eliminate Child Abuse and Neglect Fatalities, which should properly be called the Commission to Use Horror Stories to Take Away More Children. When Petit was asked, quote, what states have the best system in place to predict and deal with and prevent child abuse, he replied that the question was complicated, but, quote, I will tell you the states that do best overall are the ones that have smaller, whiter populations, unquote. Petit said when a state's population is smaller and whiter, it, quote, translates into less poverty and less complicated issues around domestic violence, around imprisonment issues, around substance abuse. But, as the Annie E. Casey Foundation explains, despite being more likely to be poor, Black and Hispanic Americans use drugs at levels comparable to, or in some cases lower, than white Americans. Perhaps Petit got that misimpression the way so many Americans do, by looking at who gets punished for substance use. And by the way, presumably Petit thinks that racism has nothing to do with, quote, imprisonment issues either. Now, Petit once ran an entire child welfare system. He was also deputy director of the Child Welfare League of America, a trade association for public and private child welfare agencies. What do such comments from the top tell us about the unconscious bias of frontline workers and others when they decide to remove children from their homes? At other times, the bias can be more subtle. A comprehensive study of racial bias in Michigan child welfare found that, quote, in several of the case files of African American families, workers described a parent as denies history of substance abuse. In case files of Caucasian families with similar documentation, workers described parent as having no history of substance abuse. The report also found that caseworkers, judges, and lawyers for children repeatedly claimed it was better for children to be torn from everyone they know and love because then they'd get to live in wealthier neighborhoods and have better, quote, cultural experiences. Now, as far as I know, that kind of research hasn't been done in Minnesota, but it's been done next door. A study of racial bias in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, suggests that caseworkers there may have a special code word for a Black family they don't like. They'll just write Chicago on the case file. Now, that report also found that, quote, data indicated that African American women who defend themselves in battering situations are often assessed as the aggressor, and their case plans then require them to attend anger management classes rather than providing them assistance as victims of domestic violence. So it's not surprising that Iowa has both one of the highest rates of disproportionality in the nation, that is, taking away children of color at rates far above their proportion of the population, and one of the highest overall rates of taking children from their families. The rates are just about the same in Minnesota. In Minnesota, for example, African American children are in foster care at triple the rate of white children. Mixed-race children are in Minnesota foster care at more than 5 times the rate of white children. The standard excuse from those who are in denial, to use one of their favorite terms, about racial bias, is also revealing. For decades, foster care apologists insisted they never took children because of poverty. Well, confront them about racial bias and they say, we didn't take all those children of color because of their race, it's because they're poor. The research makes clear that it is both. A study of decision-making at 39 children's hospitals found that, quote, black children are more likely to be evaluated for abuse than white children with comparable injuries. A study of women whose newborns tested positive for cocaine found that the child was more than 72% more likely to be taken away if the mother was black. But perhaps most telling is what happens when caseworkers are given hypothetical situations and asked to evaluate the risk to the child. The scenarios are identical, except for the race of the family. The workers said the child was at greater risk if the family was described as black. And there are also plenty of examples, of course, involving other families of color. Starting in 1958, the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, in collaboration with the Child Welfare League of America, launched a mass campaign to transplant Native American children into white adoptive homes. By 1971, nearly 1 in 4 Indian infants in Minnesota was placed for adoption. When Congress sought to prevent this destruction of Indian communities through passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act, the Child Welfare League of America opposed the law. And it was not until 2001 that CWLA's then executive director apologized to the Native American community. The apology notwithstanding, today a Native American child in Minnesota is 18 times more likely to be in foster care than a white child, the worst rate of such racial disparity in America. So congratulations, Minnesota. In other areas, you are merely among the worst in the nation. When it comes to using child welfare as a cudgel against Native American communities, you're number 1. How might we fix all of this? There are scores of recommendations at nccpr.org, and of course here in Minnesota, there's the need to pass the Minnesota African American Family Preservation Act. I'll highlight just 3 others. On racial bias, one good place to start, and I've got some good news about this, would be to adopt a practice pioneered in Nassau County, New York, just outside New York City. It's called blind removal meetings. Before workers can remove a child, they have to present the facts to a committee, but they must leave out information that gives away the race or the income status of the family. That simple step led to a significant drop in removals of African American children. And the good news is, Khalees has told me that she is working closely with Ramsey County, and they are about to pilot this idea sometime this month. Another vital step would be to turn child protective services into child poverty services. That doesn't mean you have to wipe out poverty to eliminate child abuse and neglect, though that would be an excellent idea. But you could drastically reduce what agencies labeled neglect and the stresses that may lead to abuse by simply ameliorating the worst effects of poverty. Indeed, given the extent to which many in child welfare still deny the problem is poverty, it's remarkable how often the solution is money. One study found that if you raise the minimum wage by $1 an hour, you cut the rate of what agencies call neglect by 10%. Another study found increasing the earned income tax credit by $1,000 a year cuts the likelihood of child protective services involvement by 7 to 10%. Another study found that increasing income by only $100 per year reduces the likelihood of a child maltreatment report by 2 percentage points. And given what I noted at the outset about housing, this one probably comes as no surprise. A massive study found that when homeless families received housing vouchers, the rate at which they lost children to foster care was cut by half. But one part of the study was surprising. It also found that when the housing vouchers were accompanied by inflicting social work on the families, the results were not nearly as good. The families needed more cash and less social work. Now, it also would be useful if Minnesota decision makers would finally swallow their collective pride and start looking at places that do child welfare better, which in fact is most places. It's been nearly 20 years since I first suggested that Minnesota look at the successful child welfare reforms in Alabama. Yes, Alabama. Since then, journalists from newspapers ranging from the Springfield, Missouri News Leader to the Arizona Daily Star to the New York Times did take a look and found that, thanks to a lawsuit consent decree, Alabama has indeed done an impressive job of reducing foster care. Independent court-appointed monitors found that it was done with no compromise of child safety. A member of my group's volunteer board of directors was co-counsel for plaintiffs in that suit. But the most important single change any child welfare system can make is simply to level the playing field. In other words, provide high-quality defense counsel for families. Now, Minnesota, here again, is way behind. In Minnesota, I was stunned to learn this. It's one of only 7 states where if your child is taken and you're poor, you don't automatically have a right to a lawyer at all. It's strictly at the discretion of the judge. But in most places, even when you do get a lawyer, it's usually some overwhelmed public defender who is just too overloaded to help much. But in New York City, most families get a defense team, a lawyer with a reasonable caseload, a social worker, and sometimes a parent advocate, someone who's been through the system herself. And no, that's not to, quote, get bad parents off. It's so that the team can do what child welfare agencies should do, but often don't, provide alternatives to the cookie-cutter service plans that rarely address families' real needs and can actually make things worse. A major study found that this approach reduces foster care with no compromise of safety. Even New York City's Child Protective Services Agency supports it. And as for costs, it probably saves money by reducing foster care, and in many cases, the federal government will now pay half the costs. In conclusion, right now, across the country, thousands of children are crying out, sometimes screaming to be back with their families. Minnesota is one of the places where the cries are loudest. Isn't it time we listened? Thank you very much.
How is it that with such awful high rates of children being taken away from their with such high rates of kids being taken away from their parents, how is it that we still hear about children who should have been taken but weren't, and people knew that it was wrong?
I'm so glad you asked, because they're directly related to each other. The high rate of removal makes it more likely that that will happen. When you take away so many children needlessly, you overload your workers. They don't have time to investigate any case properly. They make snap judgments. They rush on to the next case. So yeah, when you open the file after the fact, you go, oh my God, that case file had more red flags than a Soviet May Day parade. But at the time, they may have had 5 other cases that initially, when they took a quick glance, looked even worse. So yeah, that's the point. If take the child and run worked, you'd never hear about those cases in Minnesota. People would be flocking here to say, look, this is the place that keeps children safe where the horror stories don't happen. That's true. The horror stories happen everywhere. They will still happen, even if you reduce your rate of removal. But they are likely to happen less often and with far less collateral damage. So when people say, well, New York City has horror stories, I say, yeah, Minnesota has horror stories and takes away children at 5 times as many children proportionately. So what's the point of doing that?
My hunch is wrong, but I'm thinking it might not be after everything I've heard. What is the standard of proof or evidence that a worker would need to make that decision? So I'm thinking like in the legal Literally a hunch or?
Unfortunately, your worst suspicions are probably correct. Theoretically, in most, I'm pretty sure Minnesota is the same as most states on that. Well, first, let's take a step back. There are several decision points. The worker comes to the home. The worker can simply call law enforcement and take the child away without even considering a judge if the worker decides it's an emergency. The worker's theoretical standard is the lowest standard, preponderance of the evidence. That means the worker checks a box on a form saying it is ever so slightly more likely than not that whatever has been accused happened. That's enough to take the child. That is enough to hold the child in foster care month after month, sometimes year after year. The standard only rises, in theory, to clear and convincing at the termination of parental rights stage. And in addition to that, remember, when the worker checks that box on a form, it's not like there was an impartial arbiter there first. It's just the worker's guess, or it can be little more than that. And then it goes before a judge. The worker may have already taken the child, and then the judge hears the case, which the agency has had maybe 48 hours or so to prepare. On the other side is this overwhelmed birth parent who may or may not have a lawyer, particularly in Minnesota. If she does have a lawyer, odds are the lawyer met her 5 minutes before the first court hearing. So there's almost no way for the family to defend itself. So yeah, I'm afraid your suspicions are right.